Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Be the Church podcast, where we are engaging in conversations that will encourage you to live out your faith in everyday context so that you can be the church. I'm your producer, Isaiah.
And I'm one of your hosts, Kevin.
And today we have a special interview with Tyler Jacobs about reaching the homeless. Tyler, I'll introduce him real quick, is finishing up his third year as the pastoral resident at City Church here in Gainesville. And he is getting ready to go to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School for his Master's of Divinity. I think I said that all right. So, welcome, Tyler.
A lot of divinity there.
So, that's right. The more the better, you know?
Yeah. So, welcome, Tyler.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me.
So why don't you, first of all, just tell us a little bit about yourself, maybe a little bit of your backstory, and we'll get started there.
Yeah, so I came to Gainesville for school about 10 years ago, actually, at the University of Florida.
Same.
That's okay. Yeah. So we're about the same age. So,
Yep.
I actually became a Christian at UF in
Awesome.
my senior year. I, at that point, pretty much altered my entire kind of career path and obviously like vision for me where I was going with my life. And a lot of, I guess, my time at UF and how it developed was spent with Crew, actually, campus ministry.
Right.
There and then got soon involved in City Church as a member and is the same church I've been a part of since then. So that's about 6 years ago. And so since being at City Church, I kind of have, I guess, can explain how I got into ministry a little bit. I started to notice an interest, I guess, in being more involved and connected to doing work for the gospel, full time. And so when I graduated, I decided to actually intern with both Crew and City Church to feel out kind of a vocational calling. That ended up moving into me being drawn more towards a local church and feeling out pastoral ministry and thinking that this is something that the Lord might be calling me to do for long term. And so the last 2 years, I've been full time with City Church as a pastoral resident. They call me. It's kind of the second or third year, right? When you're there, they call you resident. But so then as there, one of my major areas of focus has been the outreach initiatives and community engagement that City Church does,
Sure.
particularly in downtown, but largely in the city overall. And then through that, the opportunity of, just related to even the topic of this episode, serving people experiencing homelessness in the downtown area became something that was on our radar and maybe something that I could explore more deeply as a resident. And so that formed into starting a team that serves people in that demographic. And overall myself, obviously that's a lot about my vocational side, but, love in my free time playing basketball. Got a lot of friends, obviously, that go to Aletheia, and a lot of friends actually I play basketball with that are part of Aletheia as well. So we got a crew going, which is great. So overall, the time in Gainesville is coming to a close, but I've been really grateful for my time here and what the Lord has done. And obviously, this has been, great opportunity to be on this podcast too and get to in full circle in a way.
Yeah.
Since Aletheia is one of the first churches I experienced when I became a Christian back then.
Wow.
A full circle be here and I guess be partnering with you all to kind of bring light to this issue. So
Absolutely.
No, and I love getting connected with City Church. I don't remember how long ago it was, many months ago.
Mm-hmm.
And getting to go to a seminar just was really encouraged and challenged in that. And then seeing just opportunities to partner with y'all in downtown because you guys are so strategically placed to really do outreach there. And it's been really cool to see that and has spurred wanted to talk about it more in this episode so that we can kind of give people a window into the opportunities there for sure.
Yeah.
So before we dive into the topic, I will really quickly say for you listeners out there, as you guys listen to this, as always, if you have any questions, feel free to email us at podcast@aletheagainesville.com. And we would love to continue this conversation or connect you if you are curious of how to maybe even serve with some of the opportunities that we will probably talk about with City Church or however that looks, and maybe ways to engage in your own communities wherever you may be at. Because we love not just talking about it here, but love talking with you about the future opportunities that might be there that the Lord calls us to. So again, podcast@aletheagainesville.com, and we'd love to hear from you. So to start us off, I figured it would probably be a good idea to maybe start with some definitions and some biblical overview, just to really give us a good foundation for this topic of trying to reach the homeless. So I'll let Kevin ask the first question.
Yeah. So Tyler, what kind of, maybe like as the church, and obviously as a pastoral resident underneath, the leadership at City Church, what kind of just piqued your all's interest? What motivated you guys just to start this ministry, to want to help in the first place? What kind of motivated that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think somewhat we alluded to it. Maybe it was a combination of both seeing the general calling, I think, in Scripture, in terms of God's people, for caring for people that are on the margins, or people who are maybe even considered the least of these, the poor being a big component of that, usually biblically. The general calling, seeing that more and more, but also then in our unique context, like you mentioned, I think really thinking about what it would look like for us to be more directly involved in serving people experiencing homelessness, since a lot of that demographic that we usually talk about when it comes to, say, the widow, the orphan, the poor, and the sojourner, tend to overlap in the community of people experiencing homelessness.
Yeah.
And so in our sense, because we were downtown, and because even this unique need, I think, is more prevalent in downtown, most people who are experiencing homelessness tend to gather around downtown because of the proximity of buildings and not being able to travel as much, and panhandling, things like that.
Some resources
Being available, right? That maybe the Lord was even calling us to be more intentionally involved with building relationships with people who are experiencing this. And in the past, as a church, we had been partnering with organizations, even financially, since we started, that are doing a particular outreach, mainly materially, and giving resources to people who were on the street in downtown. But I think, especially since me coming into the role as pastoral resident and having a larger staff size even, and maybe being more flexible in terms of how we can explore some things that maybe we couldn't do in the past with a smaller staff, one of the things that came up was, what would it look like for us to invest more relationally in the lives of people who are on the street, and maybe still give financially to organizations and provide materially, but how can we as a church, with what we uniquely have with the gospel, be involved in meeting the needs of people experiencing homelessness, and providing something that we believe ultimately is long-term what people most need, which is relationship with God and restoration with Him. And obviously there are people that we interact with and have met that are Christians who are living on the street and do believe the gospel, but a large majority are those that would say they don't believe. And so I think just evaluating a lot of those areas and thinking about like our local context, but also the larger call for the church overall to be for those who are weak and vulnerable, I think coming together was a thought of, maybe this is a good time where we could explore actually like doing this more often.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I love the term you brought up, least of these, which included the categories of was it widows, orphans,
right,
sojourners, and
the poor.
The poor, right. So I think that's a really good category to work off of, and just as a, it's the least of these as viewed by society, not necessarily like in any means, like the Lord does not view them as least as much as society does, and the marginalized, and those that need love. And, I have a lot of struggle in their life to have the church and others come alongside them. I think that's a helpful term to kind of look going forward. Cause, as we maybe frame it, this general idea of homelessness, I think that's a really good way to look at the people who are usually in that category. For sure.
Yep.
Would you add anything to that? Or like, as you have maybe a perspective on who might be in these categories, do you think that about covers it, or would you add any further definition there?
No, I think that's actually, I think a good way to frame it. A lot of times it's called theologically the quartet of the vulnerable, if you've heard that term before.
Yeah.
It shows up a lot in the Old Testament, where God is, when he talks to the nation of Israel about his relationship with them, and then even in particular their sin, he brings up their treatment of these different people groups.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a great way to frame it in understanding homelessness. And in particular, like as I mentioned, people who are experiencing homelessness tend to also have, a lot of difficult pasts that either have come from families with widows or are orphans themselves. But I think even more so, what we've experienced is, I think what Scripture would generally identify as the poor, like those who are, more significantly materially disadvantaged in relationship to society, I think is what probably homelessness is in our day, in a sense. Now, of course, that could include even people in low-income housing and people who are in low-income status. That's totally encompassing the poor as well. But I think even the poor in more particular maybe captures generally kind of the overlap in homelessness too. That's kind of when the Bible is talking about that demographic. Probably the closest thing that looks like that in our age is maybe people who might be living on the street, who really have like very little to their name in a material sense.
Right. Yeah. And now, would you say? I think there's probably a lot of statistics out there in, different areas and whatnot, but as you've experienced in Gainesville so far, and, as we've gone out a little bit, how do you see the population maybe changing over time? Like, do you see it being pretty dynamic and like a lot of people who come and go, or people who are just there temporarily, or do you find a lot of people who are maybe there for a really, really long time and just can't get out of it? Like, generally, do you see like a consistency of those people or a lot of transition?
Yeah, I'd say we do see a lot of transients in the sense that the people who we're serving, interacting with, could be people who are there for a solid maybe few months that we get to connect with, and see them in the town. And then for another 6 months, they might not be there at all, might be gone, and then we'll see more people. But in the sense of, I think, like how long maybe someone we've experienced is staying in the condition of homelessness, that does seem to be, at least the demographic we're talking about, generally a prolonged period of time that is a little bit, has reached more of a chronic level, I think, in a sense, than just maybe like just a quick season. But it is important to clarify that, because when you are, like we've experienced, talking to people who are living on the street or someone who is experiencing homelessness, the range could vary widely in terms of where they are in that experience. And yeah, there could be an instance in which they did have, let's say, a job or a place to live, and then that didn't go as well, or they lost it, and now they're in this period for a few months. And there are instances where someone gets back on their feet and maybe they go to a shelter, but then they're back in housing within the same year. But I think generally speaking, we've seen a lot of homelessness being driven by, I think, some more chronic issues, especially in the areas of like substance addiction and abuse, that generally can keep people trapped in this cycle of not having as much independence to be able to, let's say, go and find a job and keep it and be self-sufficient in some way, largely because of sometimes those addictions and stuff like that. So I think by and large, we do see that's definitely a key mark of homeless ministry is the dynamic transience and not even being too attached to people you might meet or be offended if they are there one day and then
don't say goodbye.
Don't say
you
goodbye.
Don't see them again for 9 months or ever.
Absolutely. It's very different from maybe what we would experience in like just a local church context. With
absolutely.
People
So you mentioned substance abuse or addiction maybe being one contributing factor to homelessness. What are some of the other ones? I think it would be important for people listening to maybe understand some of that, just because Christians are called to thoughtfully kind of engage the world and think through this. I don't want people walking away thinking that everyone on the street is, suffering from substance abuse, which I know that's not what you're saying.
Right.
But
for sure.
What are some other reasons that you've seen, maybe some at least the more common ones that you've seen that tend to be, well, and obviously usually there's a number of factors too that cause somewhere, but maybe some of like the bigger factors that more commonly lead someone to get into this position where they're now experiencing homelessness?
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of times, I think two things come to mind. One is the relationships and familiar relationships that often I think are broken or coming undone, that lead someone out of like a very stable situation that they were in, but now is suddenly in a position where they're looking for housing, and maybe they don't have as much of the resources educationally to immediately like be able to find a job and then get into housing. And so I think like a lot of the times we do meet people who have been just recently with family and let's say in homes, but have then since, because of a breakdown there, which can be related to substance abuse there as well, but it can also be a wide variety of things as well.
Right.
Abuse, they either leave or they're kicked out. And then, they're in this kind of scrambling area where they're trying to then figure out what's next. But also, I mean, even you think about mental illness as well is a huge factor. And even talking about it, you kind of get a burden of like just seeing the layers to a person's life who is experiencing homelessness that very often, like you just said, there's a combination of like relationship and familial ostracization, but then also mental illness, but then also like substance abuse. So I think, seeing even the mental illness side and realizing very, very often, I think the ability and even willingness for someone to take the next step to potentially search for housing or look for resources is inhibited by, certain psychological factors that they doubt or question or fear that kind of keeps them in that cycle as well.
Yeah. I know that when our church initially met downtown, when we first started gathering in Gainesville too, one of the things that I found with a number of the homeless that we came in contact with was the number of people that their entryway into homelessness at least was medical debt. They just like got under, they had a lot of health problems and just they didn't have health care, and so it just spiraled out of control. And so it's just important for you guys as listeners to understand that these are usually like really, really complicated circumstances. And Tyler's going to get into this a little bit more of talking about how to engage people that are experiencing homelessness and how to reach out to them. But just remember that it's usually a multi-layered, multifaceted kind of problem. And so helping them is going to take a multifaceted, multi-layered approach to hopefully see people's lives changed and transformed.
Right. So one other question I'll ask before maybe we talk about how we can help them. And this may seem like a pretty straightforward question, but I think it warrants talking about and maybe like challenging, believers in is, why should we help those who are in these places? Like, there are technically government systems. There's other things that have been set in place. So like what is the call of us as believers to maybe be intentional in this area, to actually think about, pray about, and maybe give our time, talents, and treasures towards in trying to reach and love and care for these people?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Probably one of the most important ones that we would ask for sure from the church's perspective. Why are we compelled in a sense to serve? I think getting more directly into, I guess, the spiritual side, I think one simple reason is I think as we mentioned about God's heart and his character towards like I mentioned, the vulnerable, the weak, the poor. I think there is like a logical, sequence where you think, well, if as I'm growing in my relationship with this God and I'm worshiping him and I'm growing my love for him, I should be growing in my love for the things that he cares about and the things that he's drawn to and want to be conformed to the image of what he's like. And I think a lot of times, of course, God's love and his compassion is seen and glorified in innumerable amount of ways throughout the world and in the church. But even in particular to, I think, serving people who are experiencing homelessness or people in this condition, I think there's a unique way, and which is probably largely why the Lord is drawn to this demographic. There's a unique way in which he's, I think, glorified through the service and the way in which we have compassion and grace towards people who are on the margins and experiencing homelessness, who are poor. And I think in a lot of ways you can see that as, an excitement of, although there's a lot of difficulties in serving people who are maybe experiencing this, in many ways, the Lord and his power and like the restoration of the gospel is even just can be greater seen potentially, like you were saying, in someone's life who comes out of this situation because there are so many layers. But the more, in a sense, layers and difficulties there are, I think the more opportunity there could be for the grace of Jesus and the cross to be seen and magnified. When someone maybe if they don't believe it, believes it, sees it, or maybe experiences the love of Christ through us and responds to that, even in the midst of what they're experiencing and the suffering they're going through, it can be a very powerful witness. And so I think in many ways, I think that the character of God, aligning ourselves with that character as we worship him, the way in which he's glorified uniquely in this kind of ministry as well. I also think, kind of working back on the gospel too, we talked about this in the Least of These seminar that you're referring to, But I think when you mainly you can see the character of God mostly through Jesus, as we would agree. And I think when we consider ourselves followers of Jesus, believers in Jesus, we are wanting to emulate him, but also I think even seeing that we have in some way been in the same place as people who are experiencing homeless, maybe not in the material sense, but in a spiritual sense when it comes to our sin and how we've been alienated from God and brought back through Jesus' grace towards us. I think seeing more of, in a sense, I guess I'm not totally too different from maybe someone who is in this situation. Maybe in a material way, I'm very different. I haven't been through their experiences, but in a spiritual sense, I'm just in much need as God's grace and love as they are. And so I think when we think about the gospel, and we think about being shaped by it, I think it does have a call. It compels us to want to give ourselves and pour ourselves out in a way that Jesus poured himself out for us on the cross. And so to me, from a Christian standpoint, that's the unique maybe reason why Christians should be engaged, even in comparison to maybe another religious organization.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, and I love when you think about the gospel, it is all inclusive to those who would hear it and receive it. And I think that's what sets apart Christianity so well. And that's not just for race and ethnicity, but like there's other layers for like literally every sort of categorization of humans that we have. Like there's no limitation on socioeconomic level. And the reality is, because as we talk about this, some of these terms may be down-putting, at least culturally for us, when the reality is like they are still people too. And they have the exact same spiritual needs that we do in needing Jesus, right? And as you said, 100%, like they definitely, we have different backgrounds, we have different stories, but at the end of the day, we can be connected through Christ and connected through our collective need for a savior. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'd also add that I think the uniqueness of the church in like the resources I think we have to be able to serve is important to think about as well. I think, of course, there are I think the Lord is using organizations that are doing more material work and more financial giving. And those are vital and significant. But in from a church's perspective as Christians, I think we have the relational component that maybe some other organizations and outreaches can't have, in the sense that we have the love of Christ. We're able in some sense to we should be, right? Ideally. Of course, it's all ideal, right? We're obviously all growing in this, but the idea of like we're able to be to pour ourselves out. We're able to maybe endure conversations with someone that maybe someone who doesn't have the Holy Spirit is not able to do, which often is required for this kind of ministry.
Right.
But also spiritually, of course, too, like I mentioned about the gospel, is that we have that ultimate, solution, or the ultimate prize, that even if, sure, I could serve and give materially to help this person, that's certainly important and needed, but that, as we believe, is going to fade away at the same time. And what's going to matter in the long term maybe is also like their spiritual well-being and the salvation of their souls. And so I think the church is in a unique position to come alongside those other organizations and do things that maybe they aren't as equipped to do.
Yeah. Absolutely. So I think this has been a really good talk to kind of bring us to greater foundation and understanding of who we're reaching and why we're reaching them. And then I think that brings us into probably some of the biggest questions then of how do we reach them well? Because I think a lot of people may have misconceptions or even trepidations over trying to do this. Because like, I know like with my background, you grew up and your parents like, oh, never give cash to someone, and like, what does that look like and whatnot. So I think I might just start, with a very broad question, and then we'll go into it. But how can we help those in this situation effectively?
Yeah, I think one of the ways to see an example of this, I think looking at the ministry of Jesus is
good example.
It's always good to go back to Jesus, back to the gospel accounts. I think you see in his life, especially when he cared for people maybe who are in similar conditions, I think you see a balance there between kind of a word and deed approach there. I mean, John chapter 6, where Jesus is talking about himself as the bread of life, I think is one of the passages that we go back to as a team and remembering kind of this is what our heart posture, this is very more heart level at first. I'll get to the practical in a second. But I think from a heart posture, I think finding a balance between, as I'm trying to love someone who's experiencing homelessness, I'm striving to be both caring in word and deed, and which means, kind of going back to John chapter 6, you see Jesus on the one hand, he just finishes feeding the 4,000 to the 5,000 and provides physical food for people who are weary. But then right after that, when they follow him on the boat and he crosses the sea, and they're he says, you're following me not because, of my words, but because you ate your fill of the loaves, right? And then he goes into actually sharing with them, well, let me actually share with you the true bread of life, like the true satisfaction that's gonna get at maybe that emptiness that is causing these other areas of your life to spiral out of control. And so I think if you look at that, you can see kind of that balance as well in terms of how you would care for someone experiencing homelessness. Is when you're maybe approaching them, like anybody else, you would be thinking, hopefully, there are physical needs that I would want to strive to meet, maybe based on the circumstances and my ability. Yeah. But also at the same time, I'm like mindful of how can I, at the same time, show this person that I care about them more deeply than that. And I want to maybe be there as a friend, as a presence, building a relationship that hopefully can lead to, in the long run, an opportunity for spiritual renewal if they don't yet believe the gospel. But I think from a heart level, even starting there is like, depending on the certain situation, maybe you'll do more of word loving, you could say, in that situation. Maybe the person's opening up to you about their past and their sin and maybe guilt that they've experienced, or wrestling with doubt about God and where he is in their situation, in which case maybe a lot of your conversation with them is more emotional and relational, and it's just sitting and listening, and maybe sharing tidbits about how your faith in Jesus has affected that. Maybe sometimes you'll be doing more deed ministry where the person maybe isn't in the right place to want to get into that kind of deep conversation, but you could still be with them and providing a meal and showing them that, hey, I'm here, I'm present, and I see you. So I think that is a helpful guide that we've used, that we've found to be.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up the Gospel of John. We've been working through that book together as a church now since the beginning of January. And one of the things that, as the primary communicator on Sunday mornings, that has been really, really hard for me is not diving into just solely wanting to talk about exactly what Jesus is doing and thinking and how he's interacting, but making sure I'm covering like the doctrinal things. I mean, John's just so rich, we could go through it for 5 years and not cover it all. But one of the things I've been taking staff through on Monday mornings is working through like specific interactions that Jesus has, even some that we've looked at on a Sunday morning, and trying to see, like, look more closely at the way that Jesus interacts. And it's interesting that you bring up John 6 there, because I think not only does Jesus give us a kind of a blueprint, as you're sharing there on how to do ministry, the interaction that he has with the disciples, I think also speaks really deeply to us as well. The crowds are there, they're gathered, they've been listening to him teach, and it's starting to get late and there's no food around, and the disciples come to him and basically like, hey, Jesus, we got to do something about getting rid of these people. Like, we don't have any food for them. Right. And Jesus's response is just so funny to me. He's just like, you feed them. And Jesus always has this like outstanding ability to be bothered by even like the simplest of cares of others. And I think, this can work its way across any area of ministry that you may find yourself in, but I think probably uniquely affects you guys in your ministry to those who are experiencing homeless downtown is really kind of having a mindset like Jesus of being willing to be inconvenienced for the sake of someone else. Because, and if you follow Jesus throughout the Gospel of John and see the miracles that he performs and the things that he does, he's regularly inconvenienced by his own followers, those who aren't following him, etc. But if we're going to model our ministry after him, that really is something that we need to take seriously as we approach things. And so seeing you guys even talking through how to have conversations and how to engage them beyond just providing for the material, I think is just such a beautiful kind of blueprint of displaying the compassion and the mercy and the grace that Christ lavishes upon all of us and what he's done for us. Yep. So maybe moving this in a slightly different direction, but still trying to keep up with this idea of like, how do we effectively minister to those who are experiencing homelessness? How have you seen, in your experience, maybe Christians doing more harm than good in ministering to those who are experiencing homeless?
Yeah. I think this is something that if you're familiar with the book When Helping Hurts, the other companion to it is Helping Without Hurting. One is more of the first one in line with your question, which is maybe in what ways have we helped that really has been more harmful in the long term. The other one is more of a positive, like, oh, hey, but by the way, you can help without hurting, right? That they kind of wrote after that. But I think in those books, they talk about kind of, those pitfalls you could fall in on either side, where I think from a Christian perspective, maybe one of the biggest areas is you do maybe just help from a financial standpoint, material standpoint, and you forget that you do have other resources to offer maybe in this relationship with this person that are emotional, relational, and spiritual, like I just mentioned. And thinking that, and I'd love to think that Christians are not just, throwing money out their car and then like never thinking about it again, right? But I think in a lot of ways, I think there is pressure in panhandling, or you're on your way to work and you're encountered by someone, or you don't have a lot of time because you have a next meeting, to, I think, just focus on the financial giving and not think about how could I maybe come around the block like the next time and connect with this person personally and get to know them. So that's not so much just giving financially. But on the other pitfall, I think you could fall into the idea as a Christian, which we've seen, where you are putting so much emphasis on, well, in the end, you could think what this person most needs is the gospel. What this person most needs is forgiveness. They're in this condition because they've made poor choices and because of sin. And so what we really need is not so much to care about the physical, which there's lots of opportunities for people to get and meet their physical needs around town. But what we really just need to do and focus on is preaching the gospel and just going about the spiritual all day long. And I think, of course, there's a lot of truth in that in terms of like why the person's in their condition and that we should focus on preaching the gospel. But at the same time, I think to just focus on that and forget about how someone in some sense has to be willing to listen to you before they listen to you. In a sense, they have to be attracted maybe to why they should care about your message about Jesus. And a lot of times the financial or the physical in terms of the food is a helpful way to show that I'm not just sharing with you because of a self-righteous perspective. I'm trying to just tell you what I believe and then go, but I am sharing with you because I care about you. And let me show that by how I meet your other holistic needs as well. So I think for Christians, sometimes being on either sides of that spectrum and that extreme, either focusing too much on the financial and the material, and then, or focusing too much on the spiritual and disregarding the financial and the material, can, I think, be a way in which we're maybe doing more harm in the long term and maybe missing opportunity too when it comes to people that we meet who are on the street.
And I think, I think something that a lot of believers can wrestle with in this is guilt, and just like, there's someone there, you need to be a good Christian, give them a little something, and like, okay, I've done my duty, and it becomes a very checkbox, relieve my guilt kind of mentality when, I think in regards to that, the idea of trying as possible to have long-term engagement, as you said, try to come back around the block and try to have more intentionality, if you are in a rush. And it's a very convicting topic, but I think a good one to challenge us and maybe, push us to strive for, these are people who need love and care, and like, how can we engage beyond just one time if possible, or if we do have that one time, like, how can we be intentional to listen, to hear them out? Cause like as you've already said, I think it's so important that they are people and they need people to listen to them and to talk with them and just allow them to be treated like a human, as someone who needs love and ultimately can hear the gospel and receive the truth and help of Christ.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, I would add that I think because Christians, sometimes we underestimate the power of presence, as you're saying, and the power of just being present, and maybe putting a lot of pressure on how I'm interacting and am I saying the right thing, and what's going to come out of this situation, how uncomfortable might it be. And of course, there's a lot of wisdom to exercise. You don't want to put yourself in a situation where maybe you're unsafe, or it is, maybe not as appropriate for you to be having the conversation with someone on the street. But at the same time, I think, sometimes maybe we could put too much emphasis on ourselves and what we need to say and do, and forget the power of just being present with people. I also think what Kevin mentioned about underestimating the layers of someone's past, I think can sometimes be off-putting, because I think if you're starting to engage with anybody experiencing homelessness, you'll soon maybe realize and could be overwhelmed by the amount that they share about their life and their situation. And maybe for people like us who like are having conversations about ministry a lot, or like meeting with people as a job for this, we're a little bit more used to those kind of conversations. But I think oftentimes for a lot of Christians, that can be a deterrent to maybe, from what I've experienced, what people have told me, that keeps people from engaging is they when they do, they feel like the amount that's going on in this person's life is overwhelming and a lot. And I think to your point, it's like, well, that is true. And in one sense, the Lord is still able to help and provide in that situation. But also, it's a long-term process potentially. Like, I'm not to see myself as potentially this person's end-all, be-all, one-stop shop for all the issues maybe in their life, or even their salvation itself. And so I think, like you said, seeing it as a multi-layered situation, and that it will have complexity to it, and not underestimating that, can, I think, help maybe encourage Christians to expect that when they're coming into serving in this ministry, and be more comfortable when it does happen and when people share a lot of tough things that they're going through.
Yeah. So one thing I've loved is, I've gotten to know you a little bit better, and, really process through homeless ministry, is just seeing the steps that your church with City Church has taken to just have opportunities to reach out to. I love that you refer to them as neighbors, because they are people, they are your neighbors. And I love that terminology, to be caring and more thoughtful. And then having even like the office hours intentionally, so people can stop in and just talk and have more presence and time just to process and think through stuff, I think is really, really valuable. So as you guys have engaged in this intentionality in doing this ministry, how have you seen just this opportunity and this, being the hands and feet of Christ, just affect volunteers in positive or maybe even in negative ways, in the challenge of that, in the joy of that as well?
Yeah, I think some of the key ways from a spiritual sense has been, I think, ultimately drawing us closer to the Lord. I think you could say as simply as that's put, but I think in a lot of ways, opening our eyes to the grace that Jesus has extended us, and seeing, I think, like the similarities between, like I mentioned, while we are not physically maybe able to relate in a lot of ways to people who are experiencing homelessness or the suffering that we're talking about. In a larger sense, I think when we have interacted with and learned from people that are living on the street, we see, in a sense, not only that the Lord has a heart for these people and also is seeing them just as much as he sees us, but two, that there's, I think, a sense of in which we identify with them from a spiritual sense, and have grown more in understanding, I guess apart from Christ, this maybe is kind of what the Lord sees me as. I think of that Zechariah 3 passage where Joshua is like before the Lord and Satan is accusing him, and he's clothed in like dirty garments, and then the Lord tells the angel to like put clean garments on him. And it's symbolic of, in a sense, he says later on that he is going to take away the sin of Israel in one day. It's symbolic of the sense that, well, because of our sinfulness, we are kind of, we're that's what, in an image, we are like before God. And I think doing this kind of ministry, as heavy as this may sound, I think it's opened our eyes to like the depths of how the Lord has loved us as Christians, and how gracious he has been in Jesus. And I think seeing that's a way in which we are furthering and living out the gospel is by doing this ministry as well. I think also there's a level of gratitude too for our position, I think, as volunteers, and maybe even the ways in which we've been graciously loved by the Lord in our material upbringing and our background, that I think personally for me, I did not have as much of a thankfulness for before I started to do this ministry. And it's not to say that people who are coming up from different backgrounds who are less financially advantaged are less human in any sort of way, but in the sense of like, I think growing up, you're kind of around people a lot, at least I was, in more of like a middle class American sense that are privileged and have things. And then like, I think going into the street and talking to people and seeing the disparity, I think has increased in some sense a gratefulness too for what we've been given. And seeing that in a sense, that's all by God's grace. I didn't earn this. I think hearing even people's experiences and how much their situation has affected by what they grew up with, whether that was like an abusive home or if it was, like we mentioned, a lot of the other substances addictions, and that being a very part of their life, thinking like, yeah, I guess if I was maybe in that situation growing up and not in the one that I was in, maybe my life would be very different. And maybe I would be someone who like personally was experiencing homelessness, or there was more likelihood that I was. And so I think, yeah, seeing that, oh, that's all the Lord's grace, and there's a level of like needing to be grateful for that, but also too humility still in the midst of that being humbled out of, I think, meeting the people on the street, talking to people experiencing homelessness. There's a sense, especially when we talk to Christians, but even in general, I think there's there's something to learn, I think, from people who are in that situation as well, that maybe from our standpoint, it's like we're the ones coming in with something that we want to give them. But very often we end up being encouraged and edified by what they share about either how the Lord is helping them through their situation or what they're learning about God in the midst of what they're struggling with. And so I think, yeah, often you think this is a ministry I'm doing for other people, but being involved in it has, in a lot of ways, humbled us, because we've seen how the Lord can still very much be a part of someone's life who's in this situation in ways that maybe you wouldn't have expected. So,
absolutely. Well, Tyler, thank you so much for what you've shared with us so far. I think it's going to be super helpful for anyone that's able to listen. We want to honor your time, but maybe if you just had anything maybe that you would want to close with that you thought might encourage believers who might be considering serving in a ministry that reaches the homeless, or maybe they're even thinking about something they could start in their own city where they might live, or thinking about just, maybe even thinking differently about how they might approach a panhandler. Yeah. How would you want to leave them today encouraged to consider kind of what God's call on them might be and how they can kind of answer that, but not be overwhelmed by it at the same time?
Yeah, for sure. That's a great question. Let's see if I can maybe go through a list of things in relationship to that. I think one thing to think about is, I think we talked about like local context when it comes to the least of these, and then how that relates to homelessness. I think in downtown, City Church being in downtown, that seemed to be more of a thoughtful connection of maybe this is an area where God could be calling me or calling us to just participate in. So I think in some sense reflecting over, okay, like what in my context or my local church, if I'm a part of one, or even if I'm not a part of a local church, but I am a Christian, I'm living in this part of the city, what would it look like for me to be caring for the vulnerable and the weak in that specific context? That might include people experiencing homelessness, but it could also be broader than that. But also I think for if you are in some sense thinking about serving people experiencing homelessness specifically, I think expecting and embracing challenges that would come with that is a big tip, and important to keep in mind that there's multi-layers, as we talked about, to what someone's experiencing. And, we shouldn't necessarily be surprised if we're engaging and trying to love people well, and it comes with hard conversations, or it comes with challenges. I mentioned before, if you're also thinking about, how do I interact with someone just practically, I mentioned being present and being empathetic. That so much of interaction with people is based on empathy and based on listening. It's not so much based on like what I'm sharing or anything like that. But I think we found, like any other human being, that's a way in which you demonstrate love and care for someone, is by having an open ear and showing them that I'm not really here maybe to tell you per se what to do next. And maybe if you asked me, I would be. But in a general sense, I'm just here to befriend you. And along that process, as your friend, maybe I do want to be a part of helping you in your situation. But I think the empathy and the presence does kind of cut down a lot of those barriers, I think, sometimes, that when you're meeting someone on the street, you don't know them, they're a stranger. You have a lot of guards up, they have a lot of guards up. And so I think, looking past the just the things that you want to tell them potentially, or questions you want to ask, we found it helpful to focus on the person, their story, how they got to Gainesville, for example, why they're here, try to build a relationship. And I do think in, regards to, like you mentioned, like panhandling and someone just practically that you might come across, getting names of people is very significant, in any kind of relationship. But I think that's a very dignifying thing in terms of learning their name, and then next time you see them, being able to call them by their name, and that's almost an immediate way in which you're showing them that, I know you, I've seen you. Eye contact is obviously very significant as well. I think even if you're on the street or panhandling, you maybe are used to people overlooking you, or for a lot of reasons. Maybe it's for a good reason or a bad reason, but you are avoided in some sense because it's kind of be an uncomfortable situation. And so I think eye contact and, looking at someone and being there can go a long way to show them I'm not totally unfazed by, what you're going through. And I get it. I relate to it in some capacity, and I want to still be here to love and care for you. So even just on a very practical level, I think those are some things that can be really helpful.
Right.
Absolutely.
And one thing I'll just add that I think was really helpful for me, initially thinking through this is, like, we are the church as a whole, and, we don't have to do things individually. There are definitely individual elements in this, but, we have local bodies for a reason to be equipped to understand, to engage. Because I think one of the cool things for me, coming alongside you guys with City Church, because you guys are in a better place to do that. And as the Lord has, maybe placed it on my heart and several others' hearts, to serve in this way, we could try to just do something on our own and like individually, but there's a beauty in saying like, okay, you guys understand this area a little bit better. How can we come alongside you? Yeah. How can we learn? How can we better serve and, understand and walk as the body of Christ, together. And I think there's a beauty in seeing us taking our different skills to walk forward in that. Cause like I was astonished as I learned all the different, there are multiple ministries, multiple resources in downtown in that area. And I know Gainesville is unique in that way. And not everywhere is going to be like that. But it is really interesting to see that and say okay, so how can I better serve through, these relationships Absolutely. Of ministries and services that are provided, I think has been really, really helpful in that regard. So that, it may seem intimidating wherever you're at, but to know that, a good first step is to, reach out to your pastor or, people in your local congregation, and then take that as a first step. And, as I said at the beginning, email us at podcast@aletheagainesville.com, and we'd love to continue this conversation, maybe bounce some ideas, or if you're in the local area, as I know many of you are, we'd be happy to connect you to some of the things we've been doing. And love to see you partner and serve alongside of us as you feel that calling and the Lord putting it on your heart. So, any last words?
I would just say, if you're like me and you're a reader, you're going to need a little bit more info before you're going to dive into something. Tyler mentioned the book When Helping Hurts earlier. It's by Steve Corbett and Brian Fickert. Highly recommend grabbing that book and reading it. And then there's a book on, it's going to sound like it's ridiculous that I'm recommending this book, but I promise it 100% goes to this topic. It's by a Catholic priest named Henry Nouwen called Christian Leadership. And his story is one where he was an academic. He had it all. He had notoriety. He was well known in Catholic circles for what he was doing, and the Lord called him to give all that up and go serve a different group of marginalized people, but those that suffer mental deficiencies, such as Down syndrome and other mental deficiencies. And so that book describes so well how to engage from a Christian perspective, the heart of Christ and loving least these. And especially, when Tyler was mentioning earlier, just some of the ways that he's seen this ministry impact the Christian volunteers that come alongside him at City Church. Just a lot of things that are shared in that book that I think might be helpful as well. So would recommend both those resources to people if they're interested.
Yeah, and another resource been helpful to me is Generous Justice by Tim Keller, I think, is another, if you're looking for even more of like a theological overview of, like we talked a little about, like why should the church be thinking about engaging in these issues. I think Keller does a good job of explaining it from a real gospel-centered perspective. But I mean, too, like Josh, to your point, I think if someone is listening to this and they're interested in being a part of this kind of outreach, I think you're recognizing that there might be different seasons of life in which their involvement could look different too. I know that, if you, we try to make an emphasis that if, let's say you're a parent with kids and volunteering in a consistent way to like an outreach is not as possible in your schedule, you can look at other ways in which you might be able to give financially or give materially in instances. And so we have opportunities in our church to give clothing donations and food for that reason, because I think it can vary based on your season of life in terms of maybe what the Lord is wanting to do. And then also recognizing that you're part of, like you mentioned, a larger, not only just network of the church, but then also like other organizations that probably exist in your city or part of town that you could talk to and reach out to and think about what could ways in which I could come alongside these organizations to not necessarily do what they're doing per se, but like maybe add something, especially from a Christian perspective, to caring for people experiencing homelessness in your part of town or your city. So, the internet is a great thing in terms of being able to find those resources, but also, like you said, emailing you. And of course, it goes without saying, but I'm available to, if someone emails the podcast, to continue talking about this offline as well, as much as people want to.
Yeah, we can put you in touch. Tyler, thank you so much for giving us your time just to really process through this. I know you're getting ready to head out of Gainesville, so glad we got to get you in person before that transition happens. So it's been really encouraging and hopefully convicting for all of our listeners. And so we just encourage you all to, if this has impacted you and you felt like it was something worthwhile, please share it with others so that they can learn too. This is a call and a need for all of us as believers to really consider, pray about, and just move forward. And so, as always, thanks for listening, and we encourage you all to go and be the church. Third year as the
pastoral resident. Isaiah's short-term memory is not great.
It's pretty bad.
That's why the early days of him using our tagline on the way into the podcast, listeners never notice it, but there's usually quite a bit of laughing because he'd butcher it terribly, even though it was even written like right in front of him.
Yeah, we had to do a couple takes.
That was back when Theo was on the podcast.
Yeah, as the store resident. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Be the Church podcast, where we are engaging in everyday conversations that will encourage you to live out your faith in everyday context so that you can be the church. I'm your producer, Isaiah.
You gotta redo that.
I just said everyday twice. It's fine. It's the one word I always.
What did I say he was gonna do? Yeah, I'm glad he did it for you.
It would have been totally fine if you had let it
go. I love the enthusiasm. The enthusiasm of that intro is like.
Yeah, I know.
I'm just so glad you did that.
It's one word. You could have let it go. Just saying. Alas, this happens regularly, so we're gonna.
It's been a while.
I mean, that's what
it has been a while.
Stop and start buttons.
If you weren't reading it, you wouldn't have even noticed.
I definitely noticed it literally immediately. I wrote that tagline for you, so
I know. All right.